Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters. I'm your host, Mitch. Glad to have you here. Here at the Commander's Quarters, we're all about Commander on a budget. Today we have an episode of Commander's 2 Cents. On episodes like these, I give you my own personal take on topics about the format in general and current news. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. And while you're at it, subscribe and review our podcast as well. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all of their support. Hey everyone, Mitch coming in from the Commander's Quarters studio, and today's topic's going to be cards in Commander that are basically banned. Now, when I say basically banned, I really mean that. These cards actually aren't banned. They are completely legal in the Commander format. If you go ahead and check that ban list, you won't find any of these ones I'm going to mention on them. Now, the reason I say basically banned is because Commander is a social format and it's got a social contract. There are certain unwritten rules in Commander that players are expected, for the most part, not to break. So, because of that, there are certain cards that, even though they're not banned, are pretty much frowned upon in playing in a very casual environment. And when I'm saying this entire episode, this is for casual Commander players. Again, it doesn't apply to every single Commander player. I know CDH, basically, anything goes in that. But in casual Commander, there are certain expectations for that social contract that you kind of might discuss before the game starts, that you should be discussing before the game starts. But for the most part, certain things are accepted and not accepted in Commander. And again, disclaimer, things vary between playgroup and person to person. So these are not hard and fast rules of cards that are basically banned and that you basically, some say shouldn't play in Commander. But always, as always, have that conversation with your playgroup or those at your LGS ahead of time if you're playing with or planning on playing with any of these cards, because they can rub some players the wrong way. So just make sure you have that in mind. I think it's important for especially new players in the format to kind of understand what expectations are from many others in the format. Again, not that you can't play any of these cards. Again, they're completely legal to play, but make sure you have that conversation ahead of time if you're planning on playing these cards or cards like them. So I've broken things down into a couple different categories of certain cards and card types that certain players and playgroups might not want to play against. Again, the social contract kind of doesn't have these actually officially banned, but basically banned. So let's start off with Mass Land Destruction. And the first card that is on everyone's mind when it comes to this one most likely is going to be Armageddon. Armageddon is a sorcery for 3 and a white. It says destroy all lands. So a very simple card. It just, blows up all lands. And in Commander, that's not really something that many playgroups like to play with or against. Basically, it can lead to a couple things. It can lead to a game taking a very long time, essentially kind of resetting mana bases. I mean, yes, you'll still have some mana rocks out potentially, but it can really slow things down. It can kind of come out of nowhere and really take everyone out. And again, it can turn a game that was going to be 45 minutes into a game that takes an hour and 30 minutes, 2 hours. So it kind of, again, especially if it's not expected, if it's not agreed upon ahead of time, it's a card that can definitely rub players the wrong way. This category also applies to, there are plenty of other cards in Magic that destroy a bunch of lands. Decree of Annihilation is one. It's a source that costs 8 red. It says exile all artifacts, creatures, lands, and graveyards and hands from the game. So, and it's got cycling for 5 red. When you cycle it, destroy all lands. So this one, for a couple of reasons, is kind of, it makes players a little bit salty. The first is basically it kind of resets everything, not even just lands, but it basically takes everything out except for planeswalkers and enchantments. So it really kind of slows everything down to a halt. It makes everything pretty much restart for the most part. And it's also extremely hard to stop if you cycle it. So if you're going just for cycling, then goodbye everyone's lands. And if you don't have some way to stifle it or whatnot, it's going to go through. You can't even counter it. So it's something that's very tough to stop. It's something that has kind of multiple modes that can make it a very tough experience for some players. So that's another one. Even ones that don't necessarily get rid of every single land, like a Global Ruin, are kind of on this list as well. It's a sorcery that costs 4 and a white. It says each player chooses from the lands that they control a land of each basic land type and sacrifices the rest. So essentially, you're going to get to keep between, 0 if you don't have any basics, and 5 for the player that's playing a 5-color deck. But for the most part, players might be able to keep, 1, 2, maybe 3 lands at the most. So even just one mass land destruction effects that kind of affect everyone, they do. But they take everyone down, even on not just to 0 lands, but can really set everyone back, aren't really welcome in many games of Commander. Again, I'm not going to keep saying this disclaimer, but different playgroups play different ways, so just talk. It's a social game. Sunder is another example of a different way to go about this. It's an instant that costs 3 blue. It says return all lands to owner's hands. So basically, this just bounces everyone lands, so it doesn't destroy them, but it still sets everything back, and at instant speed too. So again, it doesn't even matter that if you're destroying lands or bouncing them, you're just basically messing with mana bases, and again, that just basically is unwelcome for many playgroups. It's something that can slow the game down. It can rub players the wrong way. World Purge, I think, is even an example. It doesn't see a lot of play. And basically, it's a sorcery that costs 4 Azorius, so 8 mana in total. It says return all permanents to owner's hands. Each player chooses up to 7 cards in their hand, then shovels the rest into their library. Empty all mana pools. So this one kind of is like a entire game reset. I mean, it doesn't take life totals back to a certain number or back to the beginning, but basically this is just a, hey, let's take everything that's on the board, put it back into our hands, shuffling's back into our library, and only keep 7 cards. So we're just basically restarting the game. So it makes the game take pretty much at least twice as long. But basically, again, the main point on these is basically players don't really like when you mess with lands, specifically when it comes to resources. Another way that that can kind of affect resources like that are going to be Stax pieces, which are also, again, those basically banned kind of categories in Commander. Stasis is probably the prime example of this. It's an enchantment that costs 1 blue. It says each player skips their untap step, and during your upkeep, you pay blue or you sacrifice Stasis. So the player that's playing this is most likely going to have a way to kind of get around not having to sacrifice it. They're going to have a way to either get around that untap effect for themselves. They're going to have ways to untap other things in different ways. They're going to have a way to keep Stasis in play, so it kind of locks everyone else from untapping and potentially themselves for a good portion of their permanence, but still, they're going to have a way to keep this up. So basically, it makes the game take a very, very, very long time, and it can really grind things out. Essentially, again, Stax players, there are plenty of playgroups, and there are plenty of people that are fine playing with and against Stax, but again, I think this is one that you can't just show up to a casual table and expect that other players are going to be okay with kind of combating against the Stax deck if they're not kind of aware or expecting it. Static Orb is another card. It's an artifact that costs 3. If it's untapped, players can untap more than 2 permanents during their untapped steps. So again, this one doesn't completely ruin the untap step, but it basically says, hey, yeah, you're going to be untapping 2 things. Most likely those will be lands, and it's going to really grind the game to a halt. Winter Orb is another one, and this one actually can be very effective because this one, as long as it's untapped, players can untap more than 1 land during their untapped steps. So essentially, the player that has it usually has a way to tap it so that they can get all their things untapped and then still keep it so that the other players can't untap their lands. They can only tap 1 at a time. It just leads to a very, very kind of slow and drawn out game most of the time. Back to Basics is another one that does the same different way. It's an enchantment that costs 2 and a blue. It says non-basic lands don't untap during their controller's untapped steps. So the player playing it might just be playing a mono blue deck with a ton of basics, and they're going to be fine. But for that player that's playing, a 3, 4, 5 color deck that's got a ton of non-basic cards just to make the deck function, they're not going to be able to untap any of those non-basic lands, and they're going to be really set back and in trouble. Again, monocolor decks will be fine against this for the most part, but other decks this can really shut down. And then finally, any kind of a smokestack effect it's an artifact that costs 4. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, you may put a suit counter on smokestack. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player sacrifices a permanent for each suit counter on smokestack. So again, this kind of resource denial. This is, hey, I probably have ways to get around this or ways to take advantage of this, but we're just going to keep losing more and more permanents, most of the time being lands eventually, so that it's not just a Armageddon that comes once and just blows up everyone's lands. It's kind of like a drawn out kind of Armageddon, essentially, where it's getting rid of everything, but in a very long and drawn out way. The final category, which I think is going to have the most argument about, because there's definitely people on both sides of all these. I think that for the most part in the social contract, it's accepted that mass land destruction and Stax are really ones that you definitely have to talk ahead of time and say, okay, hey, I'm going to be playing a Stax deck. Is everyone okay with that? But this one, I think, is more so up in the air for some people. And I believe I land in the camp that this one is more so on the side of, hey, you really need to have the conversation ahead of time, and you shouldn't be surprising players with this kind of a deck, which is kind of ironic because it is kind of the surprise kind of deck. It's going to be chaos. Cards like Thieves Auction. It's a source that costs 4 red, red, red. It says set aside all cards in play. Starting with you, each player chooses one of the cards set aside and puts it into play tapped under their control. Repeat this process until all those cards have been chosen. Basically, this just flips the entire game on its head. It just is a chaos card. It turns everything on its side. It said, hey, we were playing this game of Magic, and now we're doing something completely different. Okay, you all have your own thing set up, and I'm just going to cast this, and it's going to mix everything around, and it's going to make the game, again, take a very long time. You know, if there's 50 or so permanents on the board, you've got to go through each of those, you know, permanents individually, essentially, and get it decided on who gets what and whatnot. Same thing with Scrambleverse. Scrambleverse, or another card, I guess, is Scrambleverse. It's a source that costs 6 red, red. It says for each non-land permanent, choose a player at random. Then each player gains control of each permanent for which he or she was chosen. Untap those permanents. So this one could take even longer because instead of it being a draft kind of for those permanents, basically let's just roll a dice for each and every single one and hope that we can get this figured out quickly and effectively. And again, it just really makes it kind of random on, oh, looks like, you know, that dice got rolled for you the most, so therefore you get the best permanents, and therefore you win. And it kind of just turns the game into something completely different again. Chaos, that's kind of the point of it. Warp World is another card. It's a source that costs 5, red, red, red. It says each player shuffles all permanents they own into their library, then reveals that many cards from the top of their library. Each player puts all artifact creatures and land cards revealed this way onto the battlefield, then does the same for enchantment cards, then puts those revealed cards this way that weren't on the bottom of the library in a random order. So essentially, you take everything in play, you shuffle it back in your library, and for that many things, you get those off the top into play. So this just essentially, again, turns the game into something that it was, into something completely different. It says, let's take a left turn, we're taking all of our things, and then we're going to start taking things off the top and getting them into play, and hopefully you can hit some good things. This also can really cause a problem when it comes to any kind of ETBs or whatnot. It makes it take a really long time for that to resolve, and it can just lead to a very long and drawn-out game that essentially determines the winner at random, basically. One card that does see a little bit more play than the rest of these when it comes to Chaos, and I still will be in the camp of, I think that you still need to have that conversation before the game starts if you've got this card in your deck, and that's going to be Possibility Storm. And maybe I'm the only person on that side of the argument, but that's okay. Just sharing my opinion. So Possibility Storm is an enchantment that costs 3 red, red. It says whenever a player casts a spell from their hand, that player exiles it, then exiles cards from the top of their library until they exile a card that shares a card type with it. That player may cast the card without paying its mana cost. Then they put all the exile cards of Possibility Storm on the bottom of their library in a random order. So this very much is a card that can be fun for the right group, but it's also a card that, again, flips the game on its head. It can be extremely hard to deal with, especially because if you cast your, say, Return to Nature to destroy it, okay, well, you don't get that Return to Nature. Let's then reveal cards off the top until we reveal something that shares a type with it, and then you can cast that. If that's not something that can blow up Possibility Storm, then unfortunate. You don't get that. You get something else, or maybe it's in a card that doesn't do anything at that point. So again, this pretty much just switches up the entire game and says, hey, we were playing this, and now we're just playing this extremely different variant of the game. And again, some groups enjoy it. But again, the point of this episode is that these cards are just basically banned, in my opinion. They're not actually banned. No one can stop you from playing these cards. In fact, the Rules Committee can't even stop you from playing any of the banned cards. Commander is a social format. It's up to you, and it's up to those of your LGS. It's up to your play group to decide how exactly you want to play that. I think the main point of this, again, is just basically laying out what cards are expected, or what kind of cards are expected or not expected to be played in a casual game of Commander with people that you don't know. I think that it's important to do that because there needs to be a certain baseline of everyone's expectations when they come into a game. Yes, you need to talk about power level, which again is impossible to actually determine. But, you know, a good general power level is good to start off with. But you also, I believe, need to talk about too, hey, I've got some Chaos cards in my deck. Is that okay with you? You know, if that's okay with them, great, play that deck, play those cards. If not, maybe swap out some of those cards, maybe play a different deck, find a way to make it work. Commander is a social format, so just talk. And again, keep in mind that this all is just entirely my opinion. There is no right or wrong way to play Commander, and everyone's got their own perspective on this, and that's great. So in the comments below, I'd love to hear your perspective. What do you think about my list of these basically banned cards, or the concept of cards that are basically banned because of the social contract. So yeah, let me know in the comments below, and thanks again, and have a good one. And make sure you're following us on social media for more updates and sneak peeks on future episodes. Again, a huge thank you to my patrons who help make this show possible. I truly couldn't do any of this without your support. If you want to support this channel directly, consider becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, including being able to vote on future commanders for deck techs. There are even tiers where you get your own personalized deck tech dedicated to you. You can check out all the Patreon tiers and rewards at patreon.com/commandersquarters. If you haven't already, make sure that you like and subscribe to the channel. Here at the Commander's Quarters, we're all about budget commander. So while you're at it, go ahead and check out some of our other types of episodes. And with that, I'm out of here. Thanks again, and have a good one.